Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael Farthing. I'm Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sussex, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this evening's keynote lecture, which is going to be delivered by Professor Anne Glover, Chief Scientific Advisor of the European Commission. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of those involved in the STEPS programme. I think this is a flagship programme within the university and into IDS. It's very much an interdisciplinary effort, which is very much at the heart of everything we do on this campus, and I think it's clearly been an extremely successful venture, and we hope it will continue well into the future. Secondly, I want to just underscore how important good scientific advice based on strong evidence is to us all at this particular time in the evolution of the European community and into the world in general. And in the words of Henri Cartier-Bresson, it is, I believe, a moment critique. We have the STEPS Symposium, we have this important keynote lecture, and we're in the middle of a week where the leaders of Europe are deciding how much money they're going to allocate to research in the future. And you will have seen in the press today many calls for maintaining or even enhancing the current investment. And one of those pieces stated that it is just 2% of the budget of Europe that goes into research. Some of you will know that when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, he said that his government in the future would spend 3% of our gross domestic product on research. He didn't make that. Gordon Brown cut it back to 2.5, being a slightly more parsimonious character, but we remain at 1.7. And this is a moment where we have great challenges in the global economy, in particular within Europe and to some extent in North America. This is the time when I believe that our investment in science, in research and innovation should actually be increasing as one of the most important drivers to get us out of the economic doldrums we find ourselves. So it's a real pleasure to have Anne Glover with us this evening. She is the most important scientist in Brussels at this moment in time. It's a real honour to have you with us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to James Wilson, who's going to chair the session for the rest of the evening. James.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. When we began planning the STEP Symposium about a year ago and thought about our dream team, our ideal list of keynote speakers, Anne Glover's name was top of our list. At the time, in January 2012, Anne had just taken up her role as the first ever Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission. And that appointment, the excitement, the expectation it had generated, but also some legitimate uncertainties about how that role would operate within the complexities of Brussels policymaking, seemed to us to embody so many of the themes and questions that we wanted to explore over these 2 days. Anne is a microbiologist by training and enjoyed a highly distinguished research career at Aberdeen University before in 2006 becoming Chief Scientific Advisor for the Scottish Government. Also in 2006, she was awarded a CBE in recognition of her services to environmental science. And in 2008, she was made a Woman of Outstanding Achievement in Science, Engineering and Technology. In her European Commission role, she has the rather daunting mandate of providing, and I quote, independent expert advice on any aspect of science, technology and innovation as requested by the President. So a fairly small brief. And we're really delighted, as Michael has already said, that Anne can be here, can be our keynote lecturer, and we look forward to her today answering the question, what is the right balance between respecting evidence and living in the real world? Before we start, let me just add a brief word of thanks to the team that have worked particularly hard to make tonight possible. Harriet Dudley, Julia Day, Nathan Oxley in particular, and all of those within the STEPS Centre. And can I also just mention that the debate tonight isn't purely confined to these four walls. We are on Twitter, and we've been using the hashtag STEPS13, so you can contribute to the wider discussion through that means. I won't say more now. I'm delighted to hand over to Anne Glover.
So, Vice-Chancellor, James, and all of you, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be able to talk a little bit about my role and what James has described as the very daunting brief. As he was talking about it, I couldn't help think about a kind of superwoman title there, flying through the treetops of Brussels. But it's not quite as bad as it sounds, because the wonderful thing about science, and for those of you involved in the scientific environment, you will know that other scientists are incredibly generous with their time and with their opinion. And so that can be extremely useful in being able to offer advice broadly for me within the Brussels environment. So just the title of the talk then, what's the right balance between respecting evidence and living in the real world? And I gave it that title because as a scientist, well, I love evidence. I find it really useful. I find it something to intellectually stimulating, something to challenge and to be challenged by. But I've tried to imagine what a world would look like if it was just driven by evidence. And there are lots of different types of evidence. And probably the bottom line is it wouldn't be a very nice place to live in. So bearing that in mind, as the person offering scientific evidence, at least into the debate in Brussels, then I do feel that there are lots of other things that we should consider in terms of our policy making and the decisions that we come to, rather than just the evidence. So if we think about today and more importantly tomorrow, and this has been highlighted, then the decision around the funding package for the next 7 years is going to be fought over yet again by ministers in Brussels. And you know, they've had a first stab at this before, at the end of 2012, and didn't come to an agreement. And somebody asked me, do you think they'll come to an agreement tomorrow? I think they're slightly more likely to come to an agreement tomorrow than they were last time, but I'm still not confident. But what they're deciding about is how much to invest in the research and development innovation agenda, which supports so much of what we do, particularly here in the UK, as we're so successful in achieving funding, both from the Science Excellence budget through the European Research Council, but also through the Framework Programme more generally. 80 billion euros is what's being proposed. And when this was first discussed in the European Parliament, Parliament said, well, that's fine, but is it enough? Should it not be 100 billion euros? Which in a way is quite inspirational. And yet, at the moment, member states are looking at this and they're wishing to protect other budgets. A key budget, for example, would be the agriculture budget. Much more attention on retaining that much larger budget and structural fund budget than looking at the science and innovation budget. And for me, there's some cause for concern, because investing in science, and this, what I'm saying, is an evidence-led statement. Investing in science delivers returns for us, and it delivers returns in a very broad spectrum of areas. So, of course, we generate more knowledge. That knowledge can feed into smarter, more sustainable policy. It can provide us with better environment, better healthcare, better quality of life, better energy security, better food security, better water security, all of these things. It allows us to address the global challenges. And just one thing to consider about in Europe is to remember this, that despite the fact that we're inherently modest in Europe, and we don't care to talk about our success very much, if you look at the quality and the impact of the knowledge that we generate in Europe across a very broad spectrum of research areas, we're second to none. And I think we need to ask the question that we deliver that excellent knowledge from the budget coming from the European Commission, but much, much greater budgets coming from each member state. So we produce that knowledge, and what do we truly do with the knowledge? Do we convert that world-leading knowledge into real impact for our citizens or not? And I suppose it's not a simple equation there, but I think we need to do very much more, and we need the right environment, and all of us need to work hard to produce this, the right environment to be able to engender a real appetite for the knowledge that's generated in every one of the spheres that I've just mentioned. So, I mean, is science just things that scientists do and it's not very interesting to everyone else? Well, it's not, of course. It's absolutely central to the life of every single one of us, certainly here in the developed world. So we are living in a world where from the moment we wake up in the morning till the moment we go to sleep at night, our world is largely delivered, controlled, informed by science, engineering, and technology. We've harnessed that knowledge to produce devices, to enable us to have better health care, to be able to have stimulating entertainment, whatever that might be. So that's what science is delivering. And yet, if you ask the European citizen through the device of Eurobarometer, which kind of tests the water and what do Europeans feel about different aspects of the world as delivered in Europe, then if you ask them the question, do you think technology is by and large useful on balance? Do you like technology and find it valuable? On balance, the answer is no, we don't trust technology. And yet, for every citizen that's saying that, if I opened up the bag they were carrying or I went into their home and I looked around, I would find nothing but technology that they're using that they would say, I can't do without that. So there's a mismatch then in what people are thinking technology is or who's controlling technology and what it is we've actually got. And so we have to question, and particularly for me as a scientist, I have to question, why is it that that's the view of European citizens towards technology? And why is it that they don't become much more demanding of the evidence base? And I'll give you another example. So here, if we look at how many people use mobile phones. So many of us feel that we couldn't do without mobile phones. That's the young and old, all of us. And yet, if you look at people's view about whether I want a mobile phone mast next to me, whether I think Wi-Fi is an issue for my kids in school or for me in my home, and indeed, you just need to read the press and you'll find a lot of very provocative information about the presumption that mobile phones or the masts that provide the signal can be very harmful to us. All of these things, I would say, by and large, without much evidence to underpin them. But yet, we hear a lot about this. So in terms of the balance and the debate that is out there, then if you did a straw poll in the street and asked, do you think that mobile phones or mobile phone masts are potentially dangerous, then I would be not surprised to find that many citizens thought, yeah, I think that's a problem and we need to be careful about that. And yet without them, we couldn't deliver the technology that they demand. So providing evidence and having evidence-based policy largely hangs around this idea of people's perception of risk, and also their understanding of uncertainty around the scientific evidence. And I just wanted to share with you this diagram here about perception of risk versus actual risk. And I hope you can see that reasonably well. But if you look at the top left-hand side from your point of view, terrorist attack. And above the line is the amount of public unhappiness, public outrage about terrorist attacks. Huge amount of outrage. If we look at the amount of terrorist attack, so the actual hazard at the bottom, you see how small it is in comparison. Plane crashes. People are incredibly worried about plane crashes and are outraged when there's a plane crash. On the other hand, the number of plane crashes there are leading to fatalities is quite small. And if we take the two together, then one of the, I suppose, interesting things, if you're dispassionate about this, if you look after the 11th of September terrorist attack in the US, Twin Towers attack, then after that, people became very worried about taking airplane journeys because they thought, well, look, it's really dangerous to be in an airplane because one of them could easily be flown into a big tower. And so lots of people who would normally fly moved from taking an airplane into taking their car on car journeys. And there were probably more people killed as a result of that than there had been in the terrorist attack, because driving a car is inherently more dangerous than taking an airplane. And I'm mentioning this because there's a very interesting, and this is for scientists to try and tackle, there's an interesting relationship between hazard, risk, perception of risk, and uncertainty. If we look at your right-hand side, then if we look at energy production, absolutely vital for the global society, and we look at people's perception about what's an acceptable way of generating energy and what is unacceptable. After Fukushima, nuclear power became very much the focus of our attention, and an almost immediate response in Europe was the announcement by German government that all nuclear power would be a de-investment, and that would be moved backwards. In other words, no more nuclear power policy for Germany. So if we look at the unhappiness about nuclear power, at the top of the line, you can see a substantial unhappiness. If you look at the number of deaths as a result of generating power from nuclear, so this isn't actual hazard, we're just looking at number of deaths here produced, then you can see that it's tiny. You can probably not see the little bubble below the line. And compare that with something that we're very used to, coal, for example, more towards the bottom in the pink, then people's feeling about coal and whether it's dangerous or not, not so great. But if you look at the number of deaths produced in generating energy from coal, really quite substantial. And these are things for us to tackle and try to understand, because the whole idea of how we look at risk perception, how that influences public opinion, and then what we do with that is important. So the behavior of politicians is very much influenced by public opinion. So the public, as you would expect, are much more important to the politician than the scientific advisor. Because at the end of the day, it's the public that actually elect the politician and allow them to do or to carry out the various philosophies or policies that have been developed by the politician. They represent citizens. Chief scientific advisors don't. So let's take an issue. I want to use a real example of where it's a very challenging area in which to offer scientific advice and to develop policy. And this probably won't come as a surprise to many of you, but it's genetically modified organisms. A really interesting area for me. partly because over my scientific career, I've followed this debate a lot, and many, many years ago, indeed worked on looking at the risk of release of genetically modified organisms into the environment. So I was involved in this as part of my research. So here are a category of how you might look at society at large. So some people, members of the public, will think that GMOs are safe unless proven unsafe. Okay, so that's the innocent unless proved guilty. The second part of society thinks they're unsafe unless proven safe, so more a precautionary approach. The third group think that GMOs are unsafe even if they are proven safe, because there's a problem with GMO, and that here evidence is not so important in their thinking. The next group think that they are unsafe, especially if they're proven safe, because there is a feeling that these genetically modified organisms are being imposed on us for a particular reason or because of a particular interest group, perhaps big business. And the last group, there's not many of these, but these are people who think that GMOs are safe even if there's evidence to suggest they're unsafe. So that's the background that we're working with. How are all of these views and opinions synthesized into policy on GMOs? So let's look at just Belgium, because this is where I spend my life, or most of my life these days. In Belgium, many of the municipalities in Belgium, depending on what the views of the individual population are, have said, we don't want GMO and we want to be a GMO-free municipality. Now, for those of you who've any specific involvement in looking at genetically modified organisms, plants, how pollen is produced, how there might be movement in the environment, this is a hope or a wish rather than a reality. You cannot have GM-free municipalities. And actually, just out of interest, when I was Chief Scientific Advisor in Scotland, there was a wish, and ministers kept on saying, we want Scotland to be GM-free, and we're going to talk about Scotland being GM-free. And I had many, the euphemistic way of putting it is interesting. We had many interesting discussions around this, because I said that all that would do was make politicians look foolish if they said they want Scotland to be GM-free, when it was not achievable, and much rather that they talked about their policy in a different way. But this whole idea of GM and the use of evidence in policy making, let's just have a look at what the evidence is and what the policy is in Europe around GM. So let's have a look at how member states vote in the European Parliament on any issue which deals with GMOs. So what we've got here is down the left-hand side all the member states, so 27 of them, and we've got whether they voted negatively, so negative is red, positive is green. So if they voted negatively against anything to do with GMO, or whether they voted in favour of anything to do with GMO. There's been a lot, so I'm not going to break them down. But you can see at the top there, Austria, 100% record, as does Luxembourg, of voting no. So anything with GM, just no. At the other end of the scale, if you look at Sweden or Finland, more or less 100%, a couple of abstentions, but 100% record of voting yes. Now, the challenge is that the evidence is the same, whether you're in Austria or whether you're in Luxembourg, or whether you're in Finland or you're in Sweden. And whereas the UK is in there at about, I don't know, 80% voting yes or whatever. So for me, that's a big issue. And how do we as scientists help inform this sort of debate? Because you could ask the question, well, does it really matter? We can just not have GM in Europe. Well, Let's have a look at GM policy in the European Union. There is a rigorous safety assessment. The European Food Safety Authority delivers opinions on seeds, on GM organisms, and that's based on the best available science. That comes from a broad spectrum of expert opinion, and EFSA, as such, don't have any particular axe to grind. They're not funded by an industry or a lobby group or whatever. So this we can get from EFSA. The EU ask that there be labelling of GMOs so that European citizens have the choice. So as long as you don't have to label if it goes below 0.9%, which is a challenge on the testing front, but nevertheless there is labelling. There has to be traceability, so we have to know where they come from, and also we have to offer the broader choice. So we have to offer GM as long with traditional agriculture, organic, and so on. So we need to know where our food comes from and what the background is. It does matter to me what we do with this technology, because where we are particularly faced with enormous global challenge, particularly around food security and water security, then I think we have to be very careful indeed where we're saying one technology we're just ruling out. No matter what, we're ruling it out. And it matters particularly what we do in Europe, because we have enormous influence elsewhere in the world. So particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, because of previous political involvement or political influence between European nations and African nations or other developing country nations. If we say no to GM, then where GM might be particularly useful in other areas of the world, quite rightly, I think those citizens turn around and saying, if you won't have it, why should we have it? So there are some big ethical concerns for us to address there in our rejection of particular technologies. But I suppose it comes down to the fact, do we trust scientific evidence and do we trust scientists? And actually, that's a very interesting debate, because for me, it's a matter of some pride that if you look at trust, then scientists generally are trusted by citizens. Government scientists, slightly less trusted than your non-government scientist, and I suspect I would probably fall into the category of government scientist, but nevertheless, scientists by and large are trusted. Politicians aren't trusted particularly. The media are trusted even less. So it's a very strange environment where the public say, I don't trust the media, and yet are very influenced by what's said in the media, and they vote for people to represent them who they then say they don't trust. The scientists, they say, yes, we do trust them, but when it comes to them delivering evidence, we're not quite so sure. So if we take how the view of science, or people's trust in science is developing, then if we look at this, so we're looking at public support for science, unfortunately it's decreasing. So if you look at the outer pie there, the outer pie is in 2010, the inner pie in 2005. So over that 5-year period, then you can see that in blue, which is we totally agree, we pretty much trust scientists, it's gone from 78%, over 3/4 of people saying pretty much we do trust them, down to 66% in 2010. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. And I don't want to go into too much, I'm just going to slip over this one, but just to say, again, this is a Eurobarometer study, and it's to try and help us to understanding, do scientists have knowledge that makes them dangerous or useful? And I would say it's a matter of concern that if you look at the blue bars, so the blue bars are basically saying, actually, we agree that because of their knowledge, we think scientists have information that makes them dangerous. And quite a lot of member states, over 50% are saying, yeah, that's the case. So that's the background. against which we have to try and provide evidence to give us effective policy. Where does the evidence come from? It comes from a broad spectrum of science. So there is an element of science which, of course, there is uncertainty. But I could give you one example if we think about climate change. Is there uncertainty around climate change? Well, I think I can say quite clearly that there really is no uncertainty. Amongst scientists who work in this area, there's no uncertainty that human activity on our planet is influencing our climate in a negative way. So that's a consensus. Where the uncertainty lies is what will the impact be and when. So it's to do with degrees around the margin, not with the central consensus. And I think that for that point of view, scientific evidence should be considered as being independent. And this is a nice discussion, that's another euphemism, a nice discussion I had with President Barroso before taking up my appointment at the beginning of last year in the European Commission, because I said I wanted to be seen as an independent chief scientific advisor, and he said, I don't like that word, independent. And we had a long discussion about it, and I tried to persuade him, and did persuade him, that it's of great value that a chief scientific advisor is seen to be independent of the political viewpoints of the day. Otherwise, why not just have somebody, you know, who's already there doing the job of providing some science advice? You need to bring somebody in because scientific advice or evidence does, of course, evolve over time, but it doesn't change overnight. Whereas I think many times we know that political viewpoints and opinions can do. So it's important that we have this evidence. So what's the problem? Why don't we have evidence-based policy? Well, I think it's partly because we live in a very complex world. Science is becoming more and more sophisticated and removed from the grasp of not just the everyday citizen, but the everyday politician as well. Never mind the policymaker, it's incredibly hard to keep up with what's going on. The pace of change has increased substantially, so there is a continual challenge. It almost looks like the evidence is building up, all this information is building up, and we haven't got a way to control or understand that or translate it. Sometimes people don't like what has been discovered or described by science and want it hidden away. That's really not possible. And one of the things that we do incredibly poorly is that we talk all the time about the risk, but we talk very little about reward. So in the EU policy-making process, we do risk assessments, but we look at risk and impact. We don't look at potential reward. And it's just interesting, if you go into Google and you Google risk assessment, you come up with 22.5 million or so results. If I go in and we Google reward assessment, we've got 14,500 results. So that's quite interesting from my point of view, because is it because I'm a scientist or is it because I'm a great risk taker? I don't know. But when somebody says, let's do a word association game to me, and they say risk, I say reward. Whereas if I do this with my colleagues, policymakers in Brussels, and I say risk, they say danger. Okay, so that's an interesting starting place for us to try and look at evidence-based policy making. We've always had to be able to take risk to be able to deliver progress. There has always been uncertainty, and yet what we've done is we've balanced risk against reward. I think nowadays we focus far too much on risk. We must do risk assessment, but we also need to explain to people what the reward is. Because if you only talk about the risk and not the reward, it's very hard to allow us to move forward to use the knowledge that we're generating. If we don't take risk, we can be sure others will take it. And because I mentioned to you that we generate top quality knowledge in Europe, we nevertheless seem to be racing always to be second to use that knowledge effectively for the benefit of the citizens. Someone else is using the knowledge we produce, and they're always coming out ahead of us. And for me, that's not serving the European citizen well, and it's not giving us the return on the investment that we would expect from the science that we fund. So that you can see that in some key areas we might see European leadership, but there's an awful emphasis here of using knowledge effectively for societal benefit or economic benefit in areas in Asia or North America rather than in Europe. Here's another risk, Large Hadron Collider. So you could say it took a brave decision to decide to invest simply billions in a machine to collide ions together to try and recreate what happened a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. And we're not even sure the Big Bang happened anymore, depending on what scientific papers you've been reading lately. But anyway, to recreate that moment in time, a billionth of a second, to recreate it here on Earth, that's the aspiration. And we invested billions in that. And I think you know the excitement from last year that looks like we have something that's consistent with the Higgs boson. That's very interesting to us because it gives us some insight into the fundamental nature of matter. Why does that matter to all of us? It matters a lot because, let me just remind you, this thing I'm standing at here, this is 99.99% nothing. There's nothing there. So's my hand, it's 99.99% nothing, and yet it's not going through. We don't really understand why that is. And it matters because if we understand why that is, and that's what the Higgs boson might deliver to us, then it gives us at least the opportunity to be able to manipulate that. Why that might be interesting is because I can't lift this at the moment, so it takes way more energy than I have to lift it or transport this. If I could transform this from being several tens of kilos into just a gram or two, it would take a lot less energy to move. Sounds like science fiction, but that's what knowledge about fundamental nature of matter can deliver. Anyway, we invested all this money. Was it a big risk? Well, never mind that we found something that looks like the Higgs boson. How many of you could do without the World Wide Web, which really was delivered out of necessity to be able to deal with the data being generated in an unexpected way out of Large Hadron Collider. Lots of other things that we could talk about, like positron emission tomography, PET scanners that many of you might have, retinal imaging, lots of healthcare inputs. So this has been a tremendous investment in what this was not so much a risk as an investment. So we need to, in my mind, talk much more about risk and reward. Communication is key in doing this, and picked some interesting figures, key figures communicating with each other here. Scientists are pretty bad at showing empathy for the concerns of the public. It's no good to say, well, really, don't worry about it because the evidence tells us this, and that's all you need to know. That just doesn't work. And yet scientists are traditionally and consistently bad at being able to translate or communicate the evidence and to enter into debate with the public. We also need to be much more honest about what we don't know. So many scientists just think there's a consensus, therefore I'm not going to talk about the uncertainty. And I think if we do that, we undermine our position. We must be proactive in communicating, because scientists too often think that's somehow someone else's job. It's not my job. My job's to generate knowledge, not to talk about it. If we leave it to other interested parties, then unfortunately, often we can get a lot of misleading science being discussed. We also need politicians who, because it's not just the role of the scientists, who are open to listening to evidence. I think that they also need to be clear that they don't just cherry pick what suits them, which often happens, and also that they're transparent about when they use evidence and when they don't. So a very important issue for me is when evidence is available and politicians decide not to use that evidence but to base policy on other factors, I think they have to be clear and transparent in saying we accept the evidence, but for other reasons, be they social, ethical, economic, whatever, we are having our policy based on other issues. That's transparent, it allows accountability, but it also doesn't undermine the evidence when there is absolutely nothing wrong with the evidence. Now, that's all fine, but something that's become clear to me is that in common with many of you who are scientists, I absolutely love uncertainty. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I've no idea what the day is going to be like. If I'm going into the lab, I might have some ideas of what I hope my experiments will tell me. But really, if it comes out completely differently, I don't mind. So hence the comments by the people at CERN, what if you don't find a Higgs boson? They said, well, in a way that might be even more interesting. Okay, so we love uncertainty. When I speak to politicians and say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really love it, how much do you love uncertainty? 0. They hate uncertainty. So we have a big problem then. How do we provide some kind of common ground for those of us who love and happy to talk about uncertainty and those who don't? And let me just tell you something that happened to me just a few weeks before I stepped down as Chief Scientific Advisor in Scotland. So the First Minister in Scotland is an oil economist. He thinks that, or he told me many times, particularly when we first started working together, that he said, science isn't really important, you know, all that's important is economics. And it's the economy that's important. So we had lots of discussions around the idea that, well, what do you base an economy on? And this holds for Scotland, it holds for Europe. Europe's future economy will be based on science, engineering, and technology, so we need to pay attention to it, because we will prevail and we'll be able to feed into global challenges on the basis of being smart, not on the basis of being cheaper than someone else. We need to use our knowledge base. Anyway, so we had all of these discussions, and then just before we were leaving, we had a kind of meeting to say goodbye, I suppose. And he said, you know, you always talk about uncertainty. Just for me, and just this once, could you not tell me something in science that's certain? Because there must be something. And I said, no, there isn't. I'm not going there. And he said, oh, go on. It's your last week, you know. Just give me something. Go on, push yourself. So I thought about it. And against my better judgment, I said to him, so bearing in mind this was in 2011 at the end, towards the end of 2011, I said, okay then, here's a scientific certainty for you. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So he said, well, thank you for that. We shook hands, I left, went to bed as usual that evening, woke up to the radio in the morning and heard that in Gran Sasso laboratories, they had discovered that neutrinos were traveling faster than the speed of light. So there's just an example of you should always go by your gut instincts in case, well, certainly in my case, as far as uncertainty. We subsequently know, of course, that they were not traveling faster than the speed of light, so we might say that I was right in that case. But it's just to try and illustrate the point that uncertainty is a lifeblood for us, whereas we are trying to work with a community who want certainty. So we need to think, where's the, and it's not so much the compromise, but where's the common ground that we can be really useful in providing evidence, whilst also allowing politicians to take into account many of the other areas, and policymakers too, the other areas where they have to deliver. So what can we do then? Well, stop doing the graph thing and so on, because I have just from personal experience see that that's how I can turn people off instantaneously. But we need to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. And we can often talk about consensus, scientific consensus. And nobody wants an advisor. So President Barroso once said to me, please don't ever come in here and say to me, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. He said, I don't want you to tell me that. I know that already. I want you to tell me which one. Okay, so that's quite a challenge for me. We need to communicate uncertainty, and we need to do it by using easily accepted examples, something that really connects with individuals with non-science backgrounds. We need to offer options. So certainly when we're providing scientific evidence, it's not helpful to say, this is the evidence, you need to do that. It's more, this is the evidence, here are a set of options that you might wish to consider, which would help you address the evidence in different ways, taking into account different backgrounds. And here, scientists and policymakers who are expert in this can work very well together. But we must need to, I think we do need to flag up where there is consensus. And that's something here in the UK that John Beddington did very clearly when he took up his post as UK Government Chief Scientific Advisor, where on a number of issues he said, I know there's uncertainty, and this is even amongst the Chief Scientific Advisors in the UK environment. I know there's uncertainty, but there's something we can agree on. Let's talk about that as the starting point. And that's very useful and I think very helpful. Scientific consensus can be a powerful tool because it does lead us to being able to deliver. So here are some examples, just banning CFCs and being able to address hole in the ozone layer. Using scientific evidence powerfully, that leading to helpful legislation and policy to deliver the solution to a problem. Even in the European Commission, so if we look at the biofuels, current biofuels directive, here's a complicated area because in order to be able to look at sustainable fuel supply, attention was paid to alternatives to fossil fuel, biofuels being one option. So in order to get industry to develop biofuels, you need to have legislation. That gives them the certainty for investment. If evidence then becomes available, because I said if evidence evolves, that there might be unintended consequences, and that could be indirect land use change, then you need to think about, okay, what do we do now? And what is probably not feasible overnight is to say, right, we're going to tear this up, and we're going to move in a different direction. So what, and I don't need you to look at the detail here, but what the Commission has done has said, okay, what we need to do is phase out particular areas of support for the industry working in first-generation biofuels and focus much more on second, third, and fourth-generation biofuels. So the environment needs translators who are respected by both sides. So that's the policymakers, the politicians, the scientists. There needs to be a dialogue. This is a partnership. It's not an area where there should be conflict. And one possibility would be that we, in Europe at least, look at the possibility of trying to get more prominent scientific advice right across member states. Because I have to say, from my point of view, it's actually a real drawback that in the European Union we have a chief scientific advisor here in the UK, one in Ireland, we have one in the Czech Republic, and there's one in the European Commission. And that's it. So it makes it very difficult to talk at a scientific consensus level and really agree on what we can agree on and then take that back to member states in a way that's seen as trusted and credible. So I think that this is something that for all of us would be worth working towards. And the last thing I would say to you is evidence is a very precious thing. It's not infallible, but it costs a huge amount of effort to generate scientific evidence. And therefore, we cannot afford to just disregard evidence, if you like, at our pleasure. We must be very careful and we must justify where we don't use scientific evidence. For me, that's a very democratic process. But the big challenge is particularly for scientists in trying to be much more persuasive, open, credible, understandable in taking that scientific evidence and offering it as an absolute key to being able to develop robust, long-lived, effective policy for all of us in Europe. So thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you for that rich and fascinating talk. You've given us a lot to think about. Much of what you've said resonates with the themes of our discussion earlier this afternoon. I think there are also some interesting points of difference in the way you framed some of the emphasis around risk, uncertainty, consensus that we could perhaps tease out and explore now. We don't sadly have enough time to do justice to all of this in questions, but let's at least take one or two rounds and then we can continue talking more over drinks outside.
Stephen Hill from Research Councils UK. A question about EU funding, and you mentioned the debate that's going on about the Horizon 2020 budget, and of course that's very, very important, but you also mentioned that that's a drop in the ocean compared to the member state investments in scientific research. So the question is, do we do enough to coordinate and align that spending across the union, and if we don't, how should we improve that?
Okay, so a question on budgets and alignment. More.
Willemijn Tuinstra from the Open University in the Netherlands. How do you deal with this dilemma that you can't say on the one hand and the other, but at the other hand, you're supposed to flag out consensus, but without ignoring the minority?
Okay.
Thank you. Susan Owens from the University of Cambridge. I was a bit puzzled that you were puzzled that citizens could be dependent on a large number of technologies, but at the same time be very concerned about the direction and social purpose and control of technological innovation. It seems to me that in systems that are, essentially socio-technical systems, those two things are not at all incompatible. So I wondered if we could explore that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Master Pavali, student here at SPRU. I was wondering, in a unique political environment like the EU, is scientific advice usually more or less valued as compared to a very small member state environment? Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so I'll deal with them in reverse order then. The policy-making process in the EU, or in the Commission, is absolutely fantastic. So that's a statement I would make. That's before I went there, I thought it must be absolutely appalling, because I looked at evidence and I looked at policy and I didn't always see a connection. So the first thing I did when I went is to try and find out, well, how is policy put together and so on. And as I say, I think it's incredibly impressive. However, the problem is, if it is a problem, is that if you in the UK or any individual member state put together the evidence and the policy and the impact assessment and all of these things, then you have one government that is making a decision about whether to adopt that or not. The problem is that in the European Union, you have 27 member states. And so what I've seen happen to policy is something which looks like a perfectly formed document being nibbled away at the edges and bits pushed out and pushed in because people say that won't go down with us. We don't find this acceptable, so you have to remove this. So there's a negotiation. There's the democracy of the process. So it's not as if it's not more or less valued. It's just highly politicized at the European Commission level. I think that's what you would expect in many ways. What I would hope is that if we can have more discussion around the evidence, perhaps led, I might be being too optimistic here, but led by chief scientific advisors or their equivalents in each member state, at least looking for consensus, that might improve. I'm not sure. why am I puzzled by people saying hate technology but using a lot of it? You're quite right to point out that that's not actually inconsistent. And I think the problem for me is that where we are developing, and we do have new technologies, what we don't do is we don't talk about them enough. And it comes back to the point I made about risk-reward. So when you do introduce technology, we don't talk about why we're introducing the technology and what the reward might be, as well as what the risk is. You need to talk about both. And I think if we did that more, what we might have is, and what I would wish to see, is I would wish to see a more open and questioning European citizenship that when faced with something didn't just say, no, we don't want that, or we think that must be dangerous, but say, why should we want that? Why, you know, I want much more debate. And I think if we had that, it would be a much better environment for being able to use the knowledge that we generate. So how do we deal with the on the one hand and on the other hand? From my point of view, and I do understand this, I mean, President Barroso isn't wanting me to come in and just tell him that, yeah, this or this and walk out. What he wants is the best possible evidence, and he wants to know where the uncertainties are. So at the end of the day, I can give him what I believe to be a scientific consensus on an area, taking advantage of huge networks, not just within Europe, but global networks on an issue about whether certain types of biofuel are good to be developing or not, or whatever. I can give him what we know, what the consensus is. I can tell him uncertainty. And at the end of the day, he makes a decision that the decision he makes is political. But it's based on that evidence that I've given him. But what he doesn't want is for me to say, I don't know, really, you know, it's a bit of this, a bit of that. Unless, of course, it really was like that. But, you know, in most instances, I mean, sometimes we just don't know enough to make a decision, in which case you would say that. But what they're looking for in the job is the consensus point of view plus the uncertainty, and that then allows, for me, the decision to be made from someone like President Barroso's point of view. EU funding, I think the real value of EU funding is only where it's additive. So there isn't really much point in the European Commission funding what could already be funded by member states. So if member states think that, okay, we'll cut back our research budget because we'll just try and be more successful in the European Commission, that's a disaster. The added value is potentially in areas where we can do things collaboratively. That would be infrastructure is a good example of that, where we might be able, we know we need certain infrastructure, but we can't deliver it in any one member state. So I'll give you what might be a controversial example of that. Nuclear fusion. So nuclear fusion could not be delivered by any member state or indeed any government in the world. But Europe is leading in looking at nuclear fusion and bringing in together the best thinking globally to see if it's an option that can be developed. So there's an example of where I think European funding is very valuable. Actually, and I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We'll take one more quick round. Please try and make your questions brief. Alan Irwin.
My name is Alan Irwin from Copenhagen Business School. And you spoke very persuasively, so I'm having a slight problem with the microphone, about respecting evidence. But I guess my question is about social scientific evidence. Because it struck me very much, and I guess I'm not the only person in the room who was struck like this. There are many social scientists in the audience, that you made several statements which were very much areas where social scientists have studied, and many very qualified people in the room could speak about. So, for example, the idea that people believe that unwanted new technologies can somehow be invented. I've conducted many focus groups, but I've never heard anyone ever say that, actually. I've never heard anyone so straightforwardly say they hate technology. So my question is, how does it's a general question, how does social scientific evidence feed into your world as a chief scientific advisor? And basically, I'd also want to say, How can we help you work with those things? It's a very genuine offer. We happen to be sitting in STEPS. I can't speak for STEPS. I'm not from Sussex, but I guess many colleagues would be very willing to talk about the social scientific evidence which exists around these issues so that we can have evidence of various kinds presented in this discussion.
Thank you. I'm Eric Millstone. I'm in the STEPS Centre. And I want to offer you a piece of social scientific evidence which I think might serve to question your interpretation of patterns of voting of member states on GM crops. You say, you suggested that there was something bizarre about the wide diversity of different patterns of voting, you said, with one common body of evidence. But I think social science suggests that that is something of an oversimplification. When in the UK, expert advisors assess the risks to the environment of the cultivation of GM crops, the question in effect that they're asking is, how does the cultivation of GM crops compare with other forms of high-tech, high-input agriculture? Austria, which as you acknowledge voted quite differently, is a country where there are more organic farms than the rest of Europe put together. And the question the Austrian risk assessors ask is, how does the cultivation of GM crops compare with the environmental impact of organics? And therefore, they're asking different questions and they're giving different answers because those different questions lead them to look at different bodies of evidence. And surely it's an oversimplification to think there's just one common body of evidence across all countries.
Thank you.
And I'm amazed that you think policy formulation in Europe is sound. I'm really quite amazed.
I said the process.
I think the process is also totally broken.
No.
The whole way
Disagree.
they look at GM crops, biofuels, banning triozoles with no real evidence of harm, the move towards hazards rather than risk-benefit, very hard to argue that that is a sound policy process.
And a final question from up here.
Ruth Machin, Durham University. It follows on from the questions over there, actually, in that you've focused quite a lot on evidence in your talk. I wondered if you could give us a bit of a definition, if you like, of what you class as evidence and what falls in and what falls out.
Okay. Okay. Well, I do reverse order again, although I'm desperate to get it, Bob. But anyway, so on the what classes are evidence, and actually perhaps this will also draw in the comments around social science as well, so I might take those three together. I said, but I'm aware I said it very quickly at the beginning, that there are lots of different forms of evidence. From my point of view, because I'm Chief Scientific Advisor, I tend to be looking at that evidence that's generated from the science community. However, and climate change here is again a good example. I think that we can look at the scientific evidence around climate change, we can look at the uncertainty, we can look at how we might mitigate the impact of climate change, or we might be able to look at potential solutions for climate change, and science, engineering and technology might deliver quite broadly in that sphere. However, the main problem is that we don't have a kind of a motivated public, a motivated citizenship who want us to do something. And that's because we don't understand a lot of how we, what people's reaction to the evidence is, what they feel the choices are. In other words, a lot of the social science behind it, we simply have not paid attention to. And until we do that, in my view, we'll never be able to use the science, whether it's informing solutions or whatever, until we engage with the social science. It's very difficult to do because mostly those environments are kept separate. But what we are trying to do in the Commission, and certainly that I would do personally, and I welcome your offer of help, so I'll have Copenhagen Business School down there on my list. But I think it's really important to try and think, how can we work better together to look at how we understand fully what the issues are, because right at the beginning, the world isn't just an evidence-based thing. Here's the science, let's do this. That will not work. So I completely take that on board. Bob, I don't know if you're being mischievous or not. It would, you know, it's in your DNA, so I suspect you are. But what I meant, and I'm absolutely clear about this, if you look at the process from, let's say, me as a commissioner deciding that I want a policy on something. So in many ways, it's a bit what Jill said earlier. When people come into government, they've got 30% of the things that, you know, they really want to do. Well, commissioners are the same. And so what they might say is, here's a policy I would like you to develop. The first question that's asked is, will that policy have any impact in any area whatsoever? And if the answer is no, it won't have any impact at all, there's no need to gather evidence. But if yes, of course, who's going to say no, it'll have no impact whatsoever? So it's always yes, we need to get evidence. Then, in a way, that's isolated from the process. The issue is looked at, what is the evidence? Do we need to get more evidence there? That can be gathered partly in-house, but mostly going externally and bringing that together. How it's constructed and put together, how the impact assessment is done on paper, that looks good. And I think it looks better than what happens in the UK. So on paper, it looks good. What the resultant impact is in terms of what we get in terms of policy, and you mentioned some very clear disasters in policy making, don't come from what the process looks like on paper. It comes from, if you like, how it's tampered with. I wish I hadn't said tampered with. So, rewind. It's how it's addressed by the different interested parties. And that's the challenge, and it was an answer to a previous question. It's the problem that it's not a single government. It's 27, soon to be 28 member states, each with the idea that the purpose of the European Union is to deliver what they want. So it's a problem. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at what we've got in terms of a policy-making process and try and see if there's something else we can include that makes it harder for people to be able to use it inappropriately. In terms of the idea that social science is just one part of the evidence, I absolutely agree. Let me give you an example of something, and I hope you see the connection with your question. You might know that in Europe there's a body called the European Group on Ethics for Science and New Technologies. That reports directly to President Barroso, and there are similar groups in actually each member state, and now globally there are these ethical groups that look at science and new technology. And just before Christmas, when I was sort of thinking about the first year, I thought how useful that group was. I've interacted with them a lot. Their background, they're all independent members. They're about 30% scientists, 30% lawyers, and 30% philosophers, theologians. At the moment, they're all theologians. But the ethos of the group is to try and look forward. It's always to try and, how can you be enabling in looking at a difficult issue? And I really admire that way of thinking. So I've had a lot of very positive interaction with them. They do reports in synthetic biology, biofuels. They've just done an opinion on energy and so on. But before Christmas, when I was sitting down, I was thinking, why is it that we've got a European group on ethics and science and new technologies, and we don't have a European group on ethics for business or financial services, when those areas affect us just as much in our daily lives and have the potential to be even more impactful than science and technology? And for me, that's an interesting thing, because when it comes to evidence, people often look at the evidence and let's just bash the GM debate one more time. When I talk to people now about GM, what they mostly say to me now is not that I think that the technology per se is dangerous, but they're actually, what they're telling me indirectly is they don't like how it's being applied. So they don't like the ethics of business and how this technology is being applied, and that they see as potentially risky and dangerous. And that actually deserves us our attention. We need to look at that. and actually in a whole number of other areas, and it perhaps goes back to the question about technologies. It's how we apply and use, and that requires a much more conscientious look at business ethics, financial systems as well. But that's really crucial at the end of the day, because you know, it's not scientists who are running the world or technologists or whatever. It's possibly who's running the world is some nebulous thing called the market. And what's even more worrying is I'm not sure who controls the market. I'm more sure about who's controlling scientists. So I think there could be a much better debate there, and that's where social scientists have a real strong input to try and help us understand that debate, to make it much more enabling, to open up the use of the knowledge that we're generating at European level.
And thank you.